So, we're getting a New Year's resolutions video in February. Now, you might think that's laziness, but it's actually intentional because I think New Year's resolutions suck. Also, it's not like I wasn't doing anything for this channel. Look at this new set! I think a lot of time when people impose certain rules on themselves, such as don't eat candy, don't play video games, clean your room every week, or especially New Year's resolutions, lose X pounds until June, read for 1 hour every day, etc. They don't really understand these rules and they don't understand themselves. They don't understand or appreciate what the activity they want to ban actually gives them. They don't understand why they want to include a certain activity. They don't really understand what they want, and they don't understand the downsides that come from doing it. That's why they often give up on those habits. They just don't make as much sense as those people think. I've talked about that in general in my valid reason hypothesis video, and I don't mean not understanding yourself as an insult. No one understands themselves that well, but more efficient people can work with that and make adjustments that just overall end up being better, even if they don't know why. So I think a better idea than to make those rigid rules for yourself is to prototype your rules. Create temporary rules and stick to them to the best of your ability, but then allow yourself to keep adjusting them. This does two things. First, it still creates a certain mental checkpoint. You have to clearly establish what the rule is and think about it for a second, and then have that rule as a reference instead of being all over the place and just trying to be reasonable in the moment. Second, because you're allowed to change them, that means you can figure out what formulation of the rules is more aligned with the life you want to live, without having to directly understand and put into words what you actually want, which is probably impossible. If you do your best to stick to them and it's just too hard, it's probably just unreasonable. And then when you adjust the rule, since you're essentially making a new rule, even if the adjusted rule is less strict, you're just not going to go easy on yourself. You're not going to say, let's just scrap this all together, I don't care. Just be sure to actually write them down. This is a crucial step. This idea came to me while organizing my flat. For example, choosing what shelf is going to be for what clothes. That process can be a tiny bit overwhelming because you need to consider all the shelves you have and all the stuff you have and figure out a good organization that is also convenient. Of course, in reality, you do that shelf by shelf and make changes along the way, but the fluidity of how quickly you can change your mind makes it a very unorganized process, which is not only inefficient, but is also a no-go for processes of higher impact, like something you do at work. So what I did is I used sticky notes to temporarily mark the shelves with what I'm going to be putting on them. This creates a mental checkpoint. You have to clearly establish what is going to be on this shelf instead of having a vague idea, and it separates the intellectual work of figuring out what sort of clothing is going to be on this shelf from the physical work of putting that type of clothing on this shelf, which just clears out the confusion. You make a choice and you stick with it. You don't doubt it with every new piece of clothing, which essentially means doing the intellectual work all the time. And then when it turns out, for example, that you have too much clothing on a certain shelf, you make another mental checkpoint by crossing out what is on the sticky note and writing a more precise category. Or, for example, you realize that the category you established is not that useful, and it doesn't matter whether it's a short-sleeved shirt or a long-sleeved shirt. What matters is whether it's something you wear around the house or when going out. Once you've finished organizing, you can keep the notes for a couple of days to see if this organization is actually practical. If it is, you can scrap the notes. If it's not, you can again make some adjustments and change the notes. The same can be applied to organizing any process. You're starting a new notebook. Make a draft first of where you're going to put things to do, where you're going to note new ideas, etc. And then be open to change. Don't stubbornly stick to your initial idea of how you thought to organize it. Re-establish this draft as you discover new ways to make it more convenient and efficient. But also don't just hope it will sort itself out. You need some back and forth between what you think is a good idea and then the response from the world. What works and what could be done better. If you're learning how to squat, you need to have an idea of what you're going to be doing with your upper back, your stance, how much you bend over, all that. And then you test it, you go by your ideas initially, but also allow yourself slightly to follow what feels natural. And if you find that you're moving away from those initial ideas, establish a new cue that is now informed by that initial idea working better than what you did previously, but also by your experience that it wasn't exactly the be-all end-all. Now, following this idea, we can do the same with habits. For example, limiting how much you play video games. And let's say that you're at university or you're working from home, like I do for now, just to make it simpler. You may start with a rule like, for example, only play after you get everything done that you wanted to do that day. Write this down somewhere, preferably in a place where you won't forget about it. Now, this rule seems like a reasonable approach, but it usually ends up falling flat on its face. The next day, you realize that you always plan more for yourself than you can actually get done, or you just need a break. Usually, in that case, someone will relapse and blame their lack of discipline and try again and relapse in a couple of days again, instead of realizing that the rule they chose was just stupid. Whatever place video games have in your life, it's just not what you thought. So then you can try incorporating breaks into your studying sessions to read. And you have to be perceptive and notice when you try it that reading is actually no break from studying whatsoever. It's pretty much the same thing. That's perfectly fine. If video games are a good break from studying for you and reading is not, just accept it. There's nothing wrong with that. You can work with that. Don't get too tied to an idea of what your ideal life would look like. Figure it out by yourself because you have no idea. But also, don't just get stuck in the status quo and say, hey, gaming is good for me, so let's not change anything. And the rules can get crazy specific, like no gaming on weekdays, on weekends only after 5 p.m. and only certain games. That's all fine. It's not going to be too complicated if you've arrived at those rules by yourself over time. It's not too difficult to follow. It's not something you have to constantly keep in mind. When it's tied to a certain activity, when it becomes relevant, you remember it. That's no problem. Another approach you can try, which has also worked very efficiently for me for many years, is to just cut out gaming completely. And you go for multiple weeks or months without even thinking about it, and then at some point you break and you play a lot for a while, and then you get disenchanted with video games again, and you apply that rule again. That seems wrong, but it's actually a pretty good approach. At the end of the year, you will probably end up with much fewer hours spent playing. It's a loose rule, but if it works, it works. I talked about this in the cold turkey then relapse video. That was an example of a rule to not do something, but a rule can also be to do something, like read one chapter of a book every day. And I want to give you a tip for the latter. People usually set outcome-based goals, like get 2 things done from your to-do list, basically SMART goals. And SMART goals suck for various reasons and are not supported by research whatsoever. But the biggest downside of them is exactly that they are outcome based, which is not something we have direct control over or we can accurately predict. For example, something may take days when you thought it would take only an hour. A different approach you can take is to work on it for a certain amount of time, like read for an hour every day. That's pretty good, but sometimes you end up working on it but without focusing on really getting anything done. So you don't apply yourself and never get anywhere. So my recommendation is to give yourself an or. Work on it for a certain amount of time or accomplish a certain outcome. That makes it less strict and more realistic than just outcome-based goals, but it also makes you keep in mind what you're trying to accomplish and gives you a slight incentive to get it done. So, for example, read a chapter of a book, or if it turns out the chapter is really long, or you just cannot focus, cap it at 1 hour. Or from a different perspective, read for an hour, but try to get to the end of the chapter. So here are some rules that I started implementing. First, I talked about gaming because I actually have gone back to gaming more than before, so I want to keep it more under control. So the rule is that I'm not going to be doing any gaming without socializing, either playing with friends or just playing single player games while talking with friends on a voice chat, or playing with randos on a voice chat in something like VR chat, which is something I would like to give a try. I just find that to be too convenient of a way to socialize to give it up, and I do need a certain amount of socializing to stay sane. I give myself an exception for single player games that I just have on my must playlist for the future. And maybe at some point I will find other activities that will make gaming not relevant altogether, but until I have those, there is no point in trying to forcefully look for them. Just getting gaming under control and looking for other activities in the meantime is perfect. The second area I put rules on is Instagram, and the rule I came up with for now is to just not use the For You page. Instagram is a notorious brain rot that is hard to limit the use of, so we'll see how it evolves. For YouTube, I already talked about this, and this is a very well evolved rule, and that's just only using YouTube in incognito mode so that I don't get recommendations. And now rules for doing something instead of not doing something. And I think a pretty good rule is to just work a certain number of hours a day on any extracurricular activities. So activities outside my job and outside stuff that are just baseline chores. This can be making videos, educating myself on something that will help further my career but is not directly part of my job, anything I find meaningfully productive that pushes the needle forward but don't come naturally to me. Pretty much what you would call a project. The point of this rule is to just not be lazy with my free time. It doesn't really matter what I do. Now, here comes the or part. If I'm, for example, going to the gym, that's technically goal accomplished. But what if I want to get more done? Well, if you think about accomplishing a goal as being equivalent to working on it for a certain amount of time, then it follows that achieving a goal is equivalent to a certain amount of hours worked. So I just slightly overestimate how long it took. For example, going to the gym would be equivalent to 3 hours worked. So if I was supposed to work 4 hours after work, then I still need to get 1 hour in. If my goal is to socialize and I went to an event for something like about 5 hours, and I want to get 8 hours of work done on Saturday, then I will count going out as 6 hours worked. So we'll see how these rules evolve and what new rules I add throughout the year. And to tie it back to New Year's resolutions, certainly they almost always fail. But it is a time when you get a lot of new ideas, and that's exactly why I think you should start implementing them, but don't make them set in stone. Make a draft, test it out, and make adjustments along the way. But make those adjustments to the draft and follow the new draft. Don't just go without any concrete plan whatsoever. See you in a year, and with the same joke again.